Co. We looked at moms, mothers who have children 18 or under. Mm-hmm. Do you know what they said was their most, we'll start with what they like least about their church? Is
no
that
idea.
Is that it doesn't support their emotional and mental health.
Wow.
That was number one criticism. What do you think they liked most about churches? And it was 63%, not even close to the second highest rated thing, which was like 32%.
Yeah, again, I'm clueless.
Small groups.
Really?
Moms love community.
Welcome to the Carey Nieuwhof Leadership Podcast on YouTube. I'm so glad you joined us. Hey, if you're new, make sure you subscribe. And today we've got David Kinnaman, the president and CEO of the Barna Group. And we're going to talk about church trends for 2024. It's part 2 of our mini-series on church trends for the year. David's going to talk about why America is more spiritually open, why 25% are actually still deconstructing their faith, and about why women, not men, might actually be the key to growing your church. So we're going to look at all of that and make sure you check out the incredible offers from our podcast partners. Did you know that Craig Groeschel, Chris Hodges, and I, and others, created a masterclass on creating and fueling generosity in your church? You can check it out, this masterclass, at advance.westfallgold.com or click the link in the description of this episode. And then also, one of my favorite events of the year is Rethink Leadership. I'm going to be there along with Rich Velotis, Reggie Joyner, and other leaders. Make sure you check it out. It's an incredible time for senior pastors, executive pastors, campus pastors, teaching pastors. Bring your whole team. Click the link in the episode description or go to conference.rethinkleadership.com. And now to today's episode. David, it's great to be back together again.
It's good to see you, Carey.
Yeah. So, we want to talk about trends, and I always look to your data, and I'd love to know, just right off the top, what's the most surprising thing you're seeing? Because you're studying so many areas, and there must be once in a while where your eyeballs just pop at something you're looking at right now. So what would that be for you as we open a new year?
I think this spiritual openness trend is so significant. We find that 3 out of 4 Americans say that they're spiritually open, that they want to grow spiritually. 44% say that they're more open to God today than they were before the pandemic. And that's even higher among younger people, millennials and Gen Z. More than half, 60% of Gen Zers are interested. They say they're more interested in God today than they were before the pandemic. And we've been sort of scratching the surface on this about a year or so. And even now we have even additional data to suggest that as many as 84% of Americans are spiritually open in some way. They believe the possibility that God exists. They're open to growing spiritually. And that just sort of flies in the face of what we tend to think of in terms of a secular time, or, people just don't believe anymore. Now they're open to anything and a little bit of everything. And we actually did a big study globally with teenagers where we looked at nearly 25,000 interviews in 26 countries, talking to teens in all these global contexts, 14 different languages. And we ended up calling that the open generation because they were so open to things that we were sort of expecting them to be closed to. So I think that's been a really interesting and surprising finding. You'll remember the early days of the pandemic. We sort of imagined that there might be a real kind of surge in spirituality. Pastors were almost like, "Hey guys, it's happening. It's happening." We don't want to do digital church, but there's openness. People that might be open, and it really took a while, I think, for that to kind of to show up in the social research. But it's happening. There's some openness now, and I think that should be really cause for a lot of just rethinking how we communicate the gospel and how we think about our ministry. Like I said, they're open. People are open to a lot of things. They're open to Jesus, but they're open to a lot of other things as well. And that's been a really fun thing to track for the last year and a half.
So I want to break that down a little bit, because you can look at all of the trends and all of the stats. Pew Research and other organizations like that, some big studies are showing the rise of the nones, right? Like people with no religion keeps going up. And I think I feel like America is now living out my childhood. I watched Canada become rapidly post-Christian as a teenager. And maybe it was happening when I was a kid, like back in the 70s or whatever. But, I see that happening now in the United States. And what is really interesting is it's very easy as a person of faith to say, oh, because everyone's leaving the church. People are deconverting. People say they have no religion. They're all atheists and agnostics. But that's not actually the case. That's not what the data is showing. Is that right?
That's correct. And this is one of the things that I think is so important for us as Christian leaders to marinate in, which is we still live with the long shadows of Christianity in North America, even Canada, where it's more secular than the U.S. It's still a lot of backstory of Christian belief and activity. And actually, the Pew data, I don't tend to speak for other data, and it's not my place to do that. But I'm quite certain that the rise of the nuns has sort of plateaued a bit. The last year or two, and it's not that isn't still a factor. It's just that if you double click, even on many of those people who are nuns, they're spiritually open, or they believe that the possibility that there is a supernatural dimension to life exists. So a lot of this is how we measure spirituality. And I think if we kind of zoom out on where we sit today, in the beginning of 2024, we're sort of looking ahead, looking back towards, where have we been? This is another election year in the U.S. Goodness gracious.
Here we go again.
Can we survive another one? But I actually think that for those of us in social research, we're actually looking at, are we tracking things in the right way? Do our questions, which were largely developed, 50 years ago, George Barna started the Barna Group in 1984. Wow. So this is our 40th anniversary, and Gallup was interesting. It was doing social research, for many decades before that. But they had just a couple questions they would ask on religion, and so I think a good question for us to ask is: are we really reading the signs of the times accurately? Do our questions really portray what is happening in people's lives? And I think that's what's been kind of exciting about the Spiritual Open project, is because it has given us perhaps another way of scratching at the surface of the kinds of things that are happening for people spiritually. And we just maybe haven't had the metrics to look at that before.
So it's interesting, I don't know why, because I've looked at that data and even written on some of your data on the open generation, but it just hit me, if you look at the big 5 personality traits of psychology, and again, I'm not a psychological expert, but one of them is openness versus closed, right? Do you have a closed worldview? Do you have an open worldview? What's really interesting, you think about me, born in the 60s, you're born in the 70s, but we didn't have access to information when we were a kid. Your parents' worldview was likely to be your worldview. And I'm just thinking about even seeing my kids, who are 90s children, grow up. And when YouTube came along and early social media came along, I noticed the questions they asked of me dropped because they were just getting answers everywhere. And now you look at everything from career paralysis to, for young leaders, it's I didn't know what options I had. It was I heard lawyer's a good job. I don't know. You just talk to your parents or your parents' friends or people at school. Now, it's the same thing with dating. You have an infinite sea of options. So how do I know which is the right one for me? Whereas I met my wife in school. So I wonder if openness has something to do with worldview. Any thoughts on that? And then I want to chase that rabbit a little bit further until there's nothing left, because I think this is a really interesting drill down on that. What about is that an overall, and you can use anecdotal stuff too. I know we don't have a research for everything, but is that just a personality trait of younger generations because they were raised with infinite access to information, that they're just open? I'm going to travel. I'm going to see this. I'm going to try different things. I'm not going to eat the food I was raised on. I'm going to open up my mind beyond the religion I was trained on or raised in, etc. What do you see?
I think you're nailing it on the head, which is that technology has changed our access to a variety of different ideas. I call it the gospel according to YouTube or the gospel according to TikTok. And we've actually done quite a bit of social research on this, looking at how do people inherit their views of Jesus, let's say. And in the past, you had a more binary decision to make, and we'll use some sort of broad generalizations here, but you'll follow the logic of it. In the past, you sort of do I want to inherit the faith of my parents or grandparents?
Yep.
Or do I want to do what else? It's or not. It's sort of 1 and 0. It's yes or no, black or white. And now what I think is true is we see this in our research with Gen Z especially, that they are picking and pulling from a variety of different ideas and sources, and the persuasive power of, like what my parents or grandparents believed is quickly fading. And we see this in lots of different examples. It doesn't just even have to be about faith, but it's sort of like there is this sense in which, sort of following the footsteps of your parents can feel very prosaic and very boring. And another way to think about this, we've talked a little bit on some of our podcasts and our times together about digital Babylon.
Yeah.
And that's a concept that, that we've written about and studied. And if you look at Daniel in the Old Testament, Babylon for him, coming from the Hebrew community to Babylon, he had a greater level of access, a greater question of authority, and sort of alienation from sort of his people, his community. And I think that story of Daniel is so compelling because we often underestimate how difficult it would have been to be in but not of Babylon. So he is renamed Belteshazzar. It becomes a third highest ranking official in Babylon. He serves for 3 different regimes: Nebuchadnezzar, Belteshazzar, and Darius. His story is a really profound one. And I wouldn't have recognized him as a Hebrew in most ways, except for his prayer life, except for certain ways that he sort of said, hey, this one thing I won't compromise. But because of that, when we look then at today's context, that's why I've described it as digital Babylon, because we have greater level of access, greater skepticism of authority, and greater alienation from the communities that form us. So a young person goes to bed at night, instead of being sort of read to by their parents, they're comforted by the warm glow of their smartphone,
right?
And they're entering rabbit holes, which are wonderful domains of human inquiry and ideas and beliefs and questions. And that's part of what we have to sort of imagine. So you think about the role of a local church, and this is one of my recommendations then. If we'd like, okay, how do we make this really practical? We have to acknowledge that the people in our churches are living in all these domains, these rabbit holes, the gospel according to YouTube, according to, TikTok. And we could say more about the power of a persuasive community and what we could do. But how can we become curators of gospel content? How do we help them understand a map to the treasure that is Jesus in our world? And recognizing that, hey, your parents and grandparents' Jesus might have been just as constrained as the reason you're trying to break Jesus out of that box is because you should, but he's not everything. He's got to be something in your life, and so I think there's a real power that we have as church communities to sort of think about what does it look like to do discipleship in this digital age. So I think you're onto something. Like we're trying to, it's almost like you're going from flying biplanes or bicycle travel to now being in a jet fighter of all of this information coming at you so quickly, and you've got to read and respond to the environment so quickly. That's just even a poor analogy, but just it speaks to the speed with which people are living their lives and trying to take in information and respond to the world around them.
So I haven't really had this thought until right now. We're moving into editorial. But last year I worked through Tom Holland's tome, Dominion, The Shaping of the Western Mind, and it was a work through. I mean, that is dense material. But I'm thinking about what's happening now. I'm also thinking about the Enlightenment. So you look at human history, you come through the Dark Ages, you go through the Renaissance, then you move on to the Enlightenment. And the Enlightenment in many ways was the sharing of information made possible by the connection you saw in Europe, by the sophistication of the printing press as it really developed over the centuries. And at first it was used to spread Christianity. And then somebody, people like Voltaire, et cetera, were kind of asking questions about, well, what is this about God? Or are all religions equal? And you get Kant philosophizing about it, et cetera, et cetera. So you're in the era of enlightenment. And I wonder, I would hesitate to call us enlightened at this moment in human history. I'm not sure we're getting smarter. I'm not sure we're getting more intelligent. But it was that access to information. And I wonder if what's happening, if it feels to the next generation like this is a new era of enlightenment. My parents had a very closed view. the church was very closed. It was a very closed system. And I mean, that was the heart of Protestantism, is the Roman Catholic Church was closed. Now they're taking it into Buddhism and Baha'i and made-up religions, et cetera, et cetera. But I wonder if that kind of access to information is in fact, a de facto, like, new enlightenment. I don't know what your thought is on that. That was a new thought.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really good observation. And we'll do maybe one more act of historical thinking and then move into some other practical stuff.
Sure.
But I had a chance to visit London a couple of weeks ago, probably my favorite city in the world. And about 20 years before, I got to go to Istanbul, which used to be Constantinople. And I traveled there with my dad. And many people may not realize, but Constantinople, the Roman Empire, was moved from Rome to Constantinople roughly in the year 400, in the 400s. And then it was sacked by the Ottomans in 1400, which means for about 1,000 years, with the rise of the Byzantine Empire and all sorts of other parts of human history that are just sort of glossed over, and even in my mind, like it was one of the most powerful cities in the world. And of course, the Middle East has been the cradle of civilization, et cetera. So even before that, this is the case. So modern day Turkey, could say we were sort of the place, the crossroads of humanity in Constantinople, and then became Istanbul. Fast forward to London and many of the cities of Europe, and you could say that London was one of the most significant cities for several centuries at least. And of course, English is spoken around the world. Of course, I speak English, so I don't want to have just like an Anglophile centric view of the world. But England and its way of its military, its economic power, its way of thinking about governance, the Commonwealth, lots and lots of human history sort of came and went. In fact, when you go to London, you sort of see how all of these ideas of the world were sort of brought back. Even you go to the British Museum, and there's quite a bit of controversy because even some of the great artifacts of these other civilizations were sort of brought back to London like ants, bringing things back to the anthill. So then you think about American history and the East Coast and Washington, D.C. and Boston and the Revolution, and then the American century, which was the 1900s. And we came and sort of saved civilization such as it is, if that was worth saving. And we think it was. World War I, World War II, and then the rise of technology and space and military power. And so here's the end of this little exercise in historical thinking, which is, I actually believe we are at a really critical inflection point where some of the powers of the old way of thinking, which is military, government, financial, they're still important. They're not completely buried. Of course, it matters which governments, which companies have money. But we're now in what I call the TED era: technology, entertainment, and design. They are the persuasive powers of our day. So technology, entertainment, and design that's what TED conference, the TED Talks were actually based on, those three initials. Some people don't know that. And I actually think we're in an interesting inflection point where part of what we're seeing, why we're talking about how we inherit ideas, is that it doesn't really matter what our established leaders, such as political clergy, university professors. I mean, they're just one voice in a chorus of voices, but we tend to believe these algorithms, which seem to know us better than we know ourselves.
It's frightening.
And so the West Coast, sort of like the capital of humanity, is sort of, become California, Silicon Valley. Technology companies obviously pop up all over, and they're in London, and they're in Toronto, and they're in Sydney and other places, and of course China and other places. But I think there's this really interesting moment for us as leaders to think about, what does it mean to be faithful in a new era, and how do we think about the persuasive powers of our time, and why is video more persuasive than the written word? And it's not that the written word won't matter. But why do people sort of tend to sort of take in content that way? And we're in this really interesting inflection point where I think people are really persuaded by those kinds of TED values. And so how do we as the church live faithfully in the midst of that? We're great communicators. How do we think about digital content? How do we think about helping people to curate all of these digital spaces in their lives? How do we help them how do we as the church community, even more to the point, become even more personal than the algorithms, where we know people even better than they know themselves, because the Holy Spirit helps us to help give them a decoder ring for the masterpiece they've been created to be. So I think there's some real, in this era of spiritual openness, we have a chance of coming to this work with a bit of a blank slate and say, okay, well, how can we actually help people, really understand what it means to live as humans, flourishing humans in this very complex age that we live in, and that's going to require our ability to adapt as persuasive communities. And I think we're at the front edge of really trying to imagine what that might be.
Well, I think one of the challenges with the church, if society has become generally more open, which I think you've demonstrated statistically, anecdotally, it seems to me like not all of the church, but some of the church's responses become more closed. In other words, here's what's certain, here's what's clear. This is bad, we're good. Almost back to the binary thinking you talked about, that sort of governed worldviews. Any thoughts on what is a helpful posture when you're dealing with an open generation? Because we've certainly seen, if you've got clarity and certainty and absolute, that's going to attract a certain subculture of the population. But I'm not sure it's really going to penetrate the secular mindset. Any thoughts on that?
Well, I do think that some of the churches that are growing are providing a sort of sense of certainty in a sea of uncertainty. Mm-hmm. And they're doing so not with, sort of pulpit pounding and sort of short, sort of bumper stickers, but they really are saying, if we're going to be a different kind of people in this world, we have to have a different kind of set of convictions. We have to look at Daniel and say, we are going to be people of prayer in a world that says, if you do this, you're going to get your head cut off. And it says, all right, well, we're going to keep doing it. And so I think there is something about, I want to resist the same kind of binary thinking we were talking about, which is that I don't think it's to respond to a sea of uncertainty with just more uncertainty. I do think that people need to be taught how to think, how to respond. There are different learning styles. We have better tools available to us to try to help understand who people are. And again, to be really practical, if we could organize our ministries around really knowing people, there are a ton of great resources to, whether it's the Enneagram or the Myers-Briggs or the Strengths Finder, a group we've worked with called True Center, where you look at people's motivations, spiritual gifts, and I actually think Christian communities could be places where we really sit down with, especially young people, but anyone at any stage of life could be like, hey, we want to try to help map, what are your gifts? What are the gifts you have to give? Well, how will you contribute to the mission of God in the world? And it's not just to come be a volunteer for the church or just to be a donor to the church, but we're a community to help you figure out how God has made you. And we're gonna try to know you and help you know yourself so that you can be on mission with Jesus in the world. Can we give people a real sense that ministry is going to be very personal to who they are, and then it's on the basis of that, and we can do this in small groups. We can do this in a lot of different ways. I think youth ministries and children's ministries could actually be reorganized around kind of helping to coach people into understanding who they are in Christ. You look at 2 Timothy 1, where Paul says, Timothy, we recognize your family background. You have the same faith that your mother and your grandmother had. We know that same beating heart is in you. And we're gonna fan into flames the spiritual gifts that we identified in you, and then we're gonna release you and say, God has not given us a spirit of anxiety, of fear, but of power, love, and sound mind. That is a perfect little model of how we could think about the gift developments of people around us by saying, we're gonna help you remember where you came from. We're gonna let you know who you are. We're gonna help release you into the world to be a non-anxious presence. The Mark Sayers phrase. It actually comes from Friedman, yeah. But this notion of like, can we help create people who are a non-anxious presence? So that's a kind of certainty in an uncertain world. It's a kind of like, hey, you know what? Come what may, I know who I am, even if I have money, even if I have health, even if I don't. And I actually think those are the kinds of discipling activities that this generation is just absolutely desperate for. And we're really seeing, across the board, these little signs of life. I mean, Bible sales are up 27% in North America.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, people are, you see the Asbury revival that happened just about a year ago. You see student-led movements. You see the sort of hunger for a deeper way of living, of understanding, like, we can't just sort of keep spinning out of control. This question of how do we rise to the level of the challenges that our society has, whether it's corruption or climate issues or the political landscape, which we sort of laughed about earlier. So I actually think I'm extremely hopeful about the future of ministry. I want to instill in our listeners, as we look at the data, like if there's one central point of this conversation, it's like, have hope, have courage. You can and are making a difference, and it just requires us to be really thinking a little bit different methodologically about how we take this unchanging gospel into a new generation.
You said something and glanced off it that I want to come back to, because I think it's a really important paradigm. You talked about teaching people how to think. So I see, there's probably multiple modes of this, but there's sort of the dichotomy between teaching people how to think or teaching people what to think. When you think about the open generation and people who maybe don't attend church, the people we're trying to reach, is there one approach that you think probably merits more attention, like what to think or how to think?
I think it's a both and world. Yeah. For example, we're in some cases people need to be shown, what to think about these things. We talked about, you mentioned it briefly. You talked about dating. Human relationships are very different than they were when you had sort of binary choices. I'm sitting next to someone in class. I'm interested in her. She's interested in me. I might ask her out. It's like all the proximity was limited to the physical proximity you had. That was who you could meet. And in the online world, you could literally meet anyone that the algorithm might serve up. And I actually think we need a richer theology of relationships and of singleness and of marriage and of dating. And we need to show people kind of what to think, what they can do to navigate that. And then I also think there's a level of how to think. We give them the tools so that they're able to say, I think there's a principle that's being applied here in terms of what is the purpose of marriage and what is the purpose of romantic relationships and what's the purpose of friendship and what's the purpose of children, what's the theology of the body and how we think about those things. And in my research, it is crystal clear that the vast majority of young people and of just human beings are more willing to be challenged than we are willing to challenge them. And we
like open to a challenge of their worldview or what they think, or what are you saying?
Open to a pathway that requires more of them than we sometimes imagine. And really maybe the other way to say it is that sometimes pastors, it's been easy. Church Pulse Weekly, when we hosted that, pastors have been telling us for a while, like how hard it was to get people to volunteer, or the pandemic, what a absolute disaster, and also this gifts came from it too. But it's hard. Sometimes you'll say, okay, well, we try to ask people to do things, but then they just sort of bug out. But I would say that the kinds of things that we ask people to do that are hard for them to do actually produce certain kinds of fruit in them spiritually that is really the end game of what we're here to do. Like, so by making the bar, Jesus is sort of like, wide is the path towards destruction, but narrow is the gate to life. And I think we have to have a little more narrow gate thinking, and not about like just moral rules, like you got to do these things to be good enough to be part of our community. But there is a set of activities that people, you look at how apps or gamified content keeps people moving along a path because they want to keep embracing some of this. And so we have to have, I think, a theology of helping people move along in life to earn a sort of way of thinking about this. I'll give you a good example. In the early church, a friend of mine, John Dixon, we've been talking a bit about this. He's a church historian, and he was saying that in the early church, there's really good evidence that people, before they were baptized, had to have 140 plus hours of catechism before they were baptized. Now, some part of this was because the persecution was so significant that you couldn't just have any old person, any old Joe. No offenses to Joe or Joe Jensen on my team or anyone
Joe
else
from Barna.
Yeah. Hey, Joe, thanks for listening.
We love Joe.
And you can't just have any old Joe come and join, because they might be a spy. They might be an undercover person who's going to try to infiltrate.
140 hours of catechesis should do that.
Because then you actually gave the content its chance of actually doing the work, even if it was a persecutor. The whole idea was people were being transformed by the way of thinking that required them to see the world through the lens of the Old Testament, the life and teachings of Jesus, and sort of the wisdom literature. Like they literally taught people. And this is kind of hard for me to. I've asked John Dixon probably 10 times, like, before baptism, and he's like, yeah, before baptism. I think you meant after baptism. No, before people were able to be baptized, before we would let them be called a Christian, they had to go through this sort of narrow gate thinking, because you had to understand the house that you were about to move into. And this is, like, to me, like a revelation of like, what if we tried to apply totally different cultural context than the persecution that the early church was under? But we have to have that same kind of imagination of asking people to take a journey with us. And will the typical church-going child or teenager spend 140 hours over the course of their life in church? They'll spend much more than that. So it's actually not that difficult an ask. But you have to have a scope and sequence to how people could learn what it is to be Christian. And then they can reject that or accept it. But it's very different than, in my view, the kind of spaghetti on the wall approach. And we don't have
something sticks.
Yeah, we don't have the kind of catechisms for our time that I think are required. And so, I think I'm just, like, so excited about the future of how Christian leaders and communicators and Christian communities can reimagine this role of being a persuasive community. Because, like, it's not rocket science. It is actually just human development, and we are doing good work in so many quarters. But it's going to require some imagination to think a little bit differently, because this is, coupled with the hope that I have and encouragement that I want to give leaders, is this brutal reality that it's a lot harder than you realize to disciple people, because these algorithms and digital Babylon and trying to help, like, to convince your kid that this is really true, like, it's not working in the same way. You can't just stare them in the eye and earnestly say, this is really true. Are you going to believe it or not? And because they have to be persuaded on their own, and we want the Holy Spirit to do that work in their lives. So I think we're at this really important space of recognizing that the persuasive power of our time is shifting away from the stages. It's shifting away from the sort of the established leaders. Is shifting into the testimony of lay people. Revelation 12:11 says we overcome by the blood of the Lamb and the word of the testimony. And there's actually spiritual power in hearing other people's stories. That's another great example of how we as Christian communities can become even more persuasive, is letting people who aren't paid professionals tell their story. Because then younger generations and all of us can sort of stand back in awe of what God does in people's lives and how people experience God. And again, there is a real resistance that I am seeing in the research to the professionalization of ministry, where it's like, well, you're paid to be a Christian communicator. You're paid to be a pastor. You're paid to be a Christian researcher. So we're conflicted.
So it almost what, undermines your credibility?
Correct.
In other words, this is what you're supposed to say.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And if you don't say it, you don't get paid.
And if we're being honest, Carey, I know I've wrestled with this question before of like, what does it mean to be a professional who is a Christian, or whose Christian faith also has to be a bit on display? I mean, I've had to talk about the loss of my wife to cancer, Jill. I've had to talk about, what it means to lead in a complex world. I've had to talk about the faith journeys of people who've lost their faith. Through the research. I mean, I've got lots of friends, lots of family who've been in their own journey. And when I talk to people who are, on their own journey, it's like so often at a conference, I'll talk about passing on the faith to the next generation and the research that I've done on that. And parents and grandparents and others will come out. They're like, "Man, you're reading my mail. You're talking about my kids." And I'm like, "Yeah, there's a reason." It's like all the gates are down, all the walls have been broken down. It is a battle for the hearts and minds of a generation, because these persuasive tools like the things that we thought were persuading people aren't getting to the heart of what they think. Now, again, at the same time, the faith and vibrancy of what God is doing in young people is profound. And it's like these things can be both true at the same time. Like there's a type of openness and a kind of almost like I always hesitate to use this term, but kind of revival that seems to be breaking out in certain places. Yeah. And so like let's keep fanning into flames those places of spiritual vitality. But this it requires a fun and I think a new wineskin thinking, because we can imagine that the church can reclaim its credibility in powerful ways. And one good example of this, just super practically speaking, we see this over and over and over, is as a professional Christian, if you get your paycheck from an organization that is oriented around a faith mission of a local church, a Christian business or nonprofit, those in your family don't quite understand what it is you do.
Yeah, exactly.
And it's
only an hour on Sunday. What do you do?
Yeah, exactly. And so if that's true, we have to also say, like, okay, we're kind of a marketing team we're kind of a multi-level marketing team. Like we hear from the skeptics, like we are researching people all the time who are like, hey, that youth pastor was paid to be my friend. That person. So we're conflicted. And if we at least acknowledge that, it doesn't mean we have to give up our jobs and our paychecks if we're called to this ministry.
Right.
Paul says a person should be paid for working. And he goes through several instances in the New Testament. You'll remember where he'll say things like, now I didn't ask you for any money so that you wouldn't see me as conflicted. I found my own way to pay. And so I think he's addressing some of these things. So I'm just acknowledging that in an era of, at the center of what I want to just sort of say to our listeners today is like, we have to think about being a persuasive community in new and fresh ways.
So are you saying professional clergy might be a thing of the past?
No, I'm saying they'll be an important part of the future, but their role will be curators, and their role will be helping other people to tell their stories better.
Gotcha.
And an effective professional ministry and clergy will mean that we have to say, I'm a little conflicted because, I'm asking you for money. And I think there's ways, even in the political space, some of my best friends who are pastors saying it's really hard to disciple people who are also big contributors to your organization. And because then they can't help but think kind of in a business transaction with.
If I challenge you too hard, are you going to withdraw your giving?
So I don't think those are broken systems, but they have to be re-engineered. They have to be thought of. We have to acknowledge what that might look like as we think about sort of the persuasiveness, the credibility that we have. And then at the core of this, my friend Glenn Packham is talking about sort of being creedal Christians. We regain credibility by being creedal and true to the creeds. So at the heart of being credible is really believing what we have signed up for, what we believe, right? Like really, like this is the way, to use a Mandalorian phrase. But there are all these other ways to imagine. Could we more regularly feature testimonies from people on our Sunday morning worship services of lay people, a brief interview of something God is doing in your life? How are you seeing God showing up? How are you hearing from the Lord? There's a lot. One of the coolest findings. We'll be actually talking about this in the next the next couple months. But one of the coolest findings from our research is that the resilient disciples say that they hear from God and they've experienced the reality of God being alive in their life. And habitual churchgoers and others who've walked away from faith are much less likely to say they believe God speaks in a way that's personal to them. So if we could simply amplify the number of ways we tell people, here is how God is speaking, here's how he's speaking to me, how is he speaking to you? And again, I think professional clergy are essential to that.
Okay. But
they're not the only people who can say it. And we just have to admit that they have something that hearers, listeners, those in the congregation are like, well, aren't you supposed to say that? Aren't you just paid to do that? And so if we could say, well, I believe this, and let's hear from some friends, right? Tiffany and Jeff, or Ed and Diane, whoever, like, how is God speaking to you right now? And tell me about this miracle of what happened. And when we start to, we overcome by what Jesus did and the word of our testimony. Like there is actual spiritual power to people's stories.
So everything we've discussed so far is dizzying, and we've got a lot more to discuss. But I remember some research that came out that you've written about, I've written about. From 2020 to 2022, the state of pastoral health just took a deep dive. I mean, up to 42% of pastors seriously thinking about leaving ministry, not just their calling, their emotional health, spiritual health, the number of friends that pastors had. I mean, everything just, I think we called it a 5-alarm fire in some of the projects we worked on together. Where is that sitting now as a new year opens, and what are you seeing in the state of pastoral health? Any update on that front?
Well, the 5-alarm fire has gone down to maybe a 3-alarm fire.
Okay.
It's still, there's still some flashing yellow lights. It's not probably the red lights that we saw 2 years ago. It's down now into the low 30s, the percent who say they want to quit.
Oh, okay.
So it has subsided, but it's still
a third of us. But remember, some people have self-selected out now, right? Like of that 42%, number of them left. The number of leaders I talk to now, can you believe the pandemic's 4 years ago? That's crazy.
That is crazy. Yeah.
But who are like, we have a whole new team running. Sometimes it's new senior leader. Other times it's like, a lot of the other team just kind of tapped out. We got a new team we're running. So you're seeing it as a 3-alarm fire?
Yeah, I think that's a fair statement. But it I think invites us into a new journey about pastoring, and I have such a huge heart. And the team at Barna, we're doing a resilient pastor initiative with Glenn Packiam and other really caring, godly people who want to see pastors' hearts and souls sort of revived for this next stage of the journey. And it is a set of concerning findings, just to spend just a half a minute on that, like pastors under the age of 45, ethnic minority leaders, leaders who are gifted in strategic thinking, and those who are struggling to build trust with their congregants were some of the most likely to want to quit. And so even like the notion that those who are gifted in strategic thinking, they're just like, hey, I can't keep moving forward in an environment where it's just it cannot be transformed, right? So, I think the kinds of leaders who are really feeling the pressure, we still have a lot of work to do because, I want to say in no uncertain terms, the role of pastors are so essential to the vitality of the church. It's I mean, you can't have one without the other. It's just shifting, and we have to sort of recognize even some of the themes that we've been talking about. So we've actually got sort of a number of recommendations for how we think about, reviving and supporting leaders. Number one is just recognizing that, be as healthy as you can as a leader, cultivate deep mutual friendship, invest in family, whatever brings you fun and sort of reminds you of how small you are in the world, exercising, gardening, hiking, traveling, reading for pleasure, anything that reminds us that our lives are so short, can help us just sort of stay in the game. That for me, 3+ years of bereavement, it's just like I've had a lot of fun. I've hiked, I've done drawing, I've done things that just have no real like productivity to them. And that's been critical to me. I think second, we also have to retool for the next stage of ministry and recognize that this next season is going to require agility, a kind of openness to, not controlling things. Some of the themes we've talked about, how can you become a curator of a persuasive community? And you're not the only person on stage. You're not the only person who is who can testify to the power of Jesus in our lives. That's the headline from what we've been talking about. And then finally, it's this sharing the load. I think the more we can actually have team members, laity, all sort of not on the sidelines watching us do the work, but actually, like you're a coach, you're getting people into the game and playing, you're identifying gifts and talents, you're helping them understand like how God has made them to be a masterpiece in Christ Jesus, and getting them to use those gifts and giftedness out in the world and celebrating them for that. I think we're going to have a really beautiful season of ministry the more we can become those kind of healthy leaders who look to center others and center Jesus at the middle of all that.
What has kept you resilient. You have been through a personal journey. Barna, how long have you been president now? 17 years, 16 years?
About 2007 was when I was named president, and then I took over the company more officially in 2009.
Wow.
So it's been coming on 15 years.
Wow. So, you've had to reinvent, you've had to rethink, you've been through a pandemic too, and a lot of things changed. What's keeping you resilient personally and through Jill's passing?
Yeah, my friendships, number one. Just so many amazing people that I love. I was driving across Dallas last night to see my friend Scott, and I just was like, I was feeling the surge of gratefulness for him, and we sat down, gave each other a huge hug, and then other friends surprised me, and that was a great.
Some of us came in for a surprise last night.
That was fun. So friendships are really cool. So and integral to being a single person in a way that I think for those who are listening who are married, it's not that you don't need friends. You absolutely do need friends, but there is something about being partnered in life that's different than when you're single. And that's one thing I could sort of say to our listeners is like some of the lessons that I'm learning are different because as a widower, I'm having to think about, being a single dad, running a company on my own, making plans. I've got a great team around me, but there's still decisions to make, and sort of like you got to kind of like, okay, let's look at the mirror. Like, what do I want to do right now? I've had an incredible spiritual director, Dwayne Grobman, for a number of years, 7 years now, walking through brain cancer and death and bereavement, and leadership, and just like, where is God showing up in my life? And so listening to the Lord, the scriptures have come alive to me in new ways in this season. But then in addition to friendship and just the friendship of God in all of this has been, a lot of physical activity and working out and hiking. And I've got some physical limitations. I can't run anymore because of a lower back problem, but like I'm finding other ways to redirect that energy. Just having fun doing collecting art and, sort of outfitting my townhouse and enjoying sort of new things. I moved from California to Texas about a year and a half ago. And even that sort of like forcing myself to learn some new rhythms and new ways of thinking and, sort of imagining, what this next stage of life and leadership and ministry might look like has been a lot of journaling, a lot of writing, some drawing, just like enjoying life for what it gives. And, there aren't too many benefits of losing someone to cancer, but one of them is you realize how short life is. And so you're just like every meal, every day is a gift. Like really, Jesus' mercies are new every day. And I'm really, I'm finding a way to experience that in a tangible way that I can't quite even put words to.
What I'm hearing underneath a lot of that is high intentionality. I think sometimes, I've been through seasons. One of my goals at this point in my life is to try something new every year, like maybe adopt something new in the quiver or whatever, because it's so easy to, and obviously your life disrupted in ways nobody would ever hope for or plan for. But it seems like you've been really, really intentional in that. Any word to leaders who are sort of stuck in a rut, maybe in that 32% who are still thinking, I don't really know. Like, talk about how intentional you have had to be to find that life, because I'm not sure it just comes automatically.
Yeah, I appreciate you asking. Well, I first wanted to again acknowledge that I've had a lot of good friends and input. Yeah,
but friendship is two ways.
Yeah, that's right.
Like you would have to have taken the initiative on some of those.
Yeah, that's right.
Relationships. And you're great at that with me. You'll reach out. You'll send me a video. You'll send me a text if we haven't talked in a little while. Like you're a great initiator.
Yeah, thanks, Carey. I appreciate that. Well, you're a true friend. I think there's something that has been interesting around, just deciding how I want to live in this season. Andy Crouch, one of my friends, said something really interesting a few years ago that I really took to heart. And he said, a lot of us sort of save up our retirement years to go travel the world and do things and think thoughts and enjoy life. And I took these last few years as a time. I mean, I worked pretty hard, but I also took it as a kind of early withdrawal on retirement, and it was bereavement, and it was sort of sabbatical, and it was like, hey, if I want to travel to go do something, I want to do that. I try to invest in my kids, just, cheering them on, 24, 22, and 19, so they're at a really interesting stage of life. But yeah, I think intentionality is really critical. And when you really immerse yourself in Ecclesiastes and you say, what am I doing all this for again? I mean, like, just keep rereading.
My favorite book, perhaps.
Yeah, keep rereading that, because it is it is an ointment for an ambitious soul. And most of your listeners, they're here because they want to learn how to lead. And like, the Word of God helps to change our compass towards ambition. God made you ambitious. He wants you to go do the things you were made to do and to be a masterpiece. But he also doesn't need you to do any of it. And when you start realizing, that your center is that he just wants to be your friend, that he just wants to be your father, that he just wants to help speak to your heart. And the more you can testify to that, like, God has shown up in just profound ways, because I've been able to slow down. I move at a pretty fast pace, but I've been able to slow down in really important ways, to listen to other people's stories, to pay attention, end up giving money to fundraisers for people who are sick more than I would have ever done before. I end up paying attention to, to other, to other people who have been through loss, because it's like, oh wow, I can see you now in a way that I just would have never been able to before. And I think, it's been really a pleasure to do that. It's a silly little example, but after Jill died, I actually sort of felt like life slowed down so much. And now, as I'm sort of returning back, and I've got so much enthusiasm and hope about where the church is, some of what I talked about earlier in our time together was really around this idea of creating persuasive communities for the future. And that's really what I want to devote the next number of years of my life to doing, because I think there are new tools and new ways of thinking about that, and new patterns. It's not rocket science, but it's like we haven't quite figured that out. And I want to be a small part of helping to decode our current moment. But at the center of that, I remember thinking about the end of the Matrix movie with Neo, sort of like he starts to unlock, that he actually can't be killed by the bullets. And so like, death doesn't scare me now, like it doesn't, like, walking through what Jill went through and seeing her courage to go through some of those really, really tough things. It's like, wow, that was amazing. Well, next week, next month, next year, it's just all a gift. So let's go have the best time you can possibly have, and lead as faithfully as you can. Don't try to strive and ambitiously build something, because God doesn't need you to build anything. He just wants your heart. And that's been, some of the lessons I've been learning. And I just I get it wrong often enough, and I had a lot of challenges this summer in certain ways. Just realizing, my deep need for a savior, my deep need for, like, my ambition was getting the best of me. And it's like, oh, I gotta slow down again. So at the very end of the movie, you'll remember in the Matrix, if you've seen it, Neo's like, he's almost dodging these bullets, because it's like everything has slowed down. So I feel like life is a bit more in slow motion for me, even as there's a lot of pace to it. It's like the things that would ordinarily bring a lot of anxiety, I'm like, you know what? It's really like, that's like the 67th worst thing that's happened to me this month. It doesn't really matter. It's like.
Yeah. Do you think sometimes, and I can see this because, in church, our faith gets fused with our work and also with our community. Mm-hmm. It's kind of the perfect storm as I think about it. Do you think sometimes we take it too seriously, or take on burdens that God never intended us to bear?
100%. Yeah.
How have you seen that?
Well, I think that's what we're invited into in this season of pastoring. Yeah. You've taken this journey yourself, and you've talked about it pretty publicly, both having burned out at times and then deciding to, go create a company and not lead in the local church. And I know we've had enough private conversations where you're like, you sometimes feel conflicted about that, because you sort of feel like a burden for local church leaders, which again, for the listeners, like, I know Carey pretty well, and like, this man loves you, wants to see you succeed, even feeling conflicted about, running a communications company, is that he would just as soon jump back in, try to lead people to Jesus in a local church community. And I think that is a beautiful tension to manage in ourselves. And I feel the same way. Like, I'll keep running Barna, I'll keep doing things, but like if God calls me to do something else, I'll gladly lay that down to be whatever God is called, to be faithful in whatever God's calling me to do. So I think that real courage to lead and to try to do some things, but try not to look at what other people are doing. And I want to say this without any cynicism or criticism, because I know how unique a local congregational model is. But God doesn't need you to be successful to bring people to Him. He doesn't need a big church, a small church, a medium-sized church. I think we're at an era where if we were really honest with ourselves as pastors, we're not actually doing some of the things we're asking people to do. So,
like inviting friends to church or building into people who don't know Christ,
or like if we said if we said the core value of a Christian is to be a part of a weekly gathering,
right?
Most of us don't go to another gathering where we can just be who we are and not a performer, not a persuader, not a professional. And like in this, I'll go to a really beautiful church, Pastor Jamie Miller, here in Fort Worth, Texas. And, he's asked me to speak a couple times or do things, and he's very sweet. But I'm like, hey, maybe someday, but right now I'm just here. I
just want to be Dave.
I just want to be in the community. And I think
I have that longing right now.
Yeah. And so the reason I say that is because if we're really honest, the expression of the church is really beautiful. People who work in Christian ministries, who are part of YWAM, who are on campuses at Christian colleges and universities, they're participating in the vibrancy of the church around the world. And I love what God is doing through congregations and in congregational models, but it is not the only way that people experience Jesus. And if we're being honest, that's true for us as pastors, because we're part of a broader community of Christians who are doing this. And so it's like, it's okay that we're not going to another church as a lay person, because we are actually part of the church. So I think this picture of what the church is today, you look at people who are part of discipleship communities, or who are on campuses, or who are part of, embedded residential communities, and like the church is really like alive and vibrant. And even sort of some of the reports that we hear from people around the world and in non-Western cultures, like the church is just exploding, and God is on the move in places that, like it's just remarkable. And so I think we can really have a lot of confidence that God is up to some new things, and we get to be one tiny voice in this great chorus of what God is up to.
It's a great perspective. What other trends are you seeing in terms of churches that are growing again now versus churches that are maybe struggling a little bit more? We can talk about vibrancy, health, not just the external metrics, but what are some other trends that you're noticing when it comes to church growth, church decline, church health?
Well, I think each church has its own story to tell. And I think we've talked about this a little bit. Some are actually really booming by virtue of the number of people that seem to be engaged. And that's to be celebrated. Some are really still kind of sputtering along, and that's okay too. Like that's God isn't honored by more people. He's honored by faithfulness. So, I think we just have to keep resetting our metrics of success towards what is faithfulness, not as faithful and fruitful. But sometimes fruitfulness doesn't necessarily show up in the way we would think, oh, well, this is more people. And that's been a huge thing the last 4 or 5 years, our work with Glue and this idea of flourishing people. Are you helping people to grow in obviously their spiritual life, but also their relational well-being, their financial and vocational well-being, their emotional and mental health, sort of, are they becoming, it's the John 10:10, life and life to the full, more abundant people? And there's some really good ways to do that. Like, we actually have some tools, the Church Pulse, which is a free assessment you can take. How are our people doing? And are we helping them to become even more faithful and fruitful in their lives? And so the churches that are really growing are rebuilding from the ground up in terms of the way they think about ministry, just so that it's not like, hey, we got a higher percentage of people this week than we did last week. And they're actually thinking, okay, how do we actually disciple people? Because at the center of some of our problems as the church in North America is that we haven't really discipled people as deeply as we imagine. And the pandemic kind of helped to show that. My friend Mindy Calliguire said, the pandemic, her metaphor for the pandemic was that everyone was skinny dipping in the surf, and then the tide went out. And we were like sort of naked and ashamed as we realized, like
You can see who was swimming without shorts.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. We're all a little bit more emotionally needy. We're all a little bit more thin. The pretenses of what we imagined our life was built on were sort of stripped away. And I think that's why we have. It's at least part of the reason why we have a moment of spiritual openness is people are trying to rebuild their lives in a different way. And we should be really cautious not to rebuild our churches in the old way.
Oh, that's good.
We need to rebuild our churches in a new way, just like people are trying to rebuild their lives in new ways. So if we are not able to go to the deep places to help people build deeper wells, dig deeper wells, I don't think we're going to be the places of comfort and restoration. Let me just talk about one study we did with MOPS, and that's called the Mom Co. We looked at moms, mothers who have children 18 or under. Mm-hmm. Do you know what they said was their most, we'll start with what they like least about their church? Is
no
that
idea.
Is that it doesn't support their emotional and mental health.
Wow.
That was number one criticism. What do you think they liked most about churches? And it was 63%, not even close to the second highest rated thing, which was like 32%.
Yeah, again, I'm clueless.
Small groups.
Really?
Moms love community. Preaching and teaching was number 5 on the list, 23%. So moms need community more than they need more content. Now, it doesn't mean that content is unimportant. It just means the content has to support community. And so I think if we started to see ourselves as community facilitators, how do we hear the testimony of other moms, because they have an internal monologue. All of us as human beings have an internal monologue. You're beautiful today. You're not beautiful today. You're insecure about these things. Whatever. I think that's part of what I'm saying. My internal monologue has really changed in the last 5 years because I lost my wife. It was the worst thing I could have imagined, and I'm still here. God is still good. He is still so faithful to me. Life is still so beautiful. And my interior monologue has changed fundamentally because of what the Word of God and friendships have done, and the friendship of Jesus in these years. Now, if we could help to amplify my story alongside a chorus of other stories, moms who are saying, I thought I was inadequate. I thought I wasn't a great mom. I thought I didn't have what it takes. And in the company of other Christians who say, no, the story you're telling yourself is not true. And here's a better way to think about your life. So this is what the church can be. This is a place that we can help people build deeper wells, because it's like all of a sudden, it's not that they're just looking at the internet, like, how do I make sense of being a new mom? How do I make sense of, all the inadequacies that I feel? Instead, they're turning to community and they're turning to Jesus, and they're saying, no, we can actually be better moms. We can be better at what we do. And this is one of the clear findings of the research, is that while pastors want to help women in their communities, they want to help moms. 9 out of 10 pastors are men. They don't quite get the issues. And I've experienced this. They don't quite get the issues of singleness, because most of them are men. Most of them are married men. And so, they'll be up. I was at church on Valentine's weekend, and they're giving out gift bags to all the married couples. Like, hey, we love married couples. And some of my single friends and I were sitting there looking at each other like, well, sucks to be us, I guess. And so pastors have a real task to figure out, how do you speak to the broad spectrum of people that are there, and then how do you show up in a way that really doesn't tend to prefer one class of people, the married folks.
Yeah, and that singleness is not some state of deficiency.
Correct. Yeah, but moms, and this is what the study that Momco worked with us on, is like, boy, they are an activating agent when they are like a conduit for energy into other people. So if you say, guys, here's what we want to go do, they will mobilize and resource and explain. They're going to be behind you. They're going to be the best evangelists for your church, for Jesus. And so, how do you partner with moms to help them understand the masterpiece that their kids have been created to be? So you start to see some of the threads we've been pulling together, helping young people, helping moms, helping parents figure out how their kids are wired in light of Jesus' message in the world, is one of the great gifts you can give. And I promise you will mobilize, you'll attract parents and families if you just simply say, we're not just here to kind of build a church attendance machine. We're here to build a masterpiece identification, because Jesus has made you to be something special in the world. And he wants you to go serve him at a great sacrifice in the world. And I'm just here to tell you, the data says this is what Gen Z, what young people are like, they're waiting for. They're hungry for that kind of vision.
They're waiting for community. They're waiting for connection. You know, it's interesting because scarcity drives value. What is valuable? Things that are scarce, right? That's true in life of the intangible things. That's also true financially.
Wide is the path, narrow is the gate.
Yeah. But you think about like 20 years ago, content was scarce. It was hard to get. And we were raised on a model of preaching. Community was everywhere. And community has taken a huge hit over the last 30 years, 20 years, 10 years, 5 years. And content has been exploding. So I totally get that moms are like, we have enough content. Like, we know where to go. Yeah. We can be very well fed. There's a million free Bible study plans, a million YouTube talks, like, you know, TED Talks. Like, we can go anywhere and get great stuff. What we're dying for is relationship, community. So you're talking about rebuilding your church along those lines, prioritizing things that are scarce.
Yeah, that's right.
And that doesn't mean you stop preaching.
Correct.
Because we still have to teach people how to think. We got to show them what to think, et cetera, et cetera. But that's really helpful.
Well, maybe one little double click on that. So preaching and teaching are really critical, and you'll never hear anything other than that the proclamation of the word, that Jesus comes and walks among us. Like, the preaching of the word is something sacred, special. It will never be replaced in any time in human history. And we should just acknowledge that it's not the only rhetorical tool that people need to learn. So if you were trying to teach someone how to play the piano, for example, you don't just preach at them. You know, you have to sit down and they have to do some work. And I actually think that's the other thing I'm sort of referring to here, is that to be a persuasive community, you need preaching, you need the homiletical tools, you need Jesus to be proclaimed. It's the daily bread. And you need other kinds of more didactic or structured thinking, because people need to know how to play their part in the great symphony of God's work in the world. They have to learn how to play the piano. So when it comes to like relationships and dating, you know, let's just be honest. Most people don't come every weekend. Even if you do a great sermon series, they're going to hear a little piece of it. So people need some structure. They need, you got to put some 2x4s up in the buildings that they're living in. You've got to sort of see where all of this fits. And that is, I think, a great opportunity for us as a church community. So moms, it's like, it's not just community for any purpose. It's community so that they know how to live in this calling of motherhood in a biblical way, in a way that says, here is what it means to be on mission with Jesus. And that's amplified through teaching and preaching, but it's not only through preaching and teaching. So I think by the way, moms invite us to a both and thinking that I think a lot of us, at least as men, I could speak for, tend to be a little more either or thinking. And I think moms are a powerful force in our church communities. We actually see in the data some of the idea that if you win the man, you win the family. It's actually more accurate to say if you get the mom, you have the heart of the family. You have the persuasive heart of the family, that people look back to their moms as the much more shaping influence on them in terms of faith. And that's a sad indictment on men in some ways. But like even Paul in 2 Timothy says, I remember the faith of your mother and your grandmother. Crickets in terms of where the men show up.
What about dad? Yeah. No, this might be a few years old, but I remember the studies that say who determines who buys the family vehicle. And you would think it's the guy, car guy. No, it's the woman.
Yeah.
And it's like, this isn't going to work with car seats, or this isn't going to work with 3 kids if we have a 3rd kid.
Right.
And so adept salespeople kind of realize, okay, this guy thinks he's driving the decision, but she actually is.
Exactly.
So how do you do ministry? You've already partially answered the question, but what does it look like to win the heart of a mom in a ministry then, knowing that you probably then have the family?
I think it's to facilitate great community, to ask for their input. I mean, we are in an era of personalization and of participation. So if your church is not a place of personalization and participation, you find that people will tune out because they think you're trying to enroll them in your plan. So I think creating community, creating structure for them to experience a godly community, giving boundaries to how that can work, but inviting them into the mix. Again, I'm convinced that we have so many resources in our communities and in our tradition to help people understand who they're made to be, and like what makes them unique, and how we can deploy them on mission in the world. And that's actually an incredibly salient question for parents. Like, how do I direct my kids to the right educational paths and the right kind of developmental opportunities? If anything, we idolize our children in our society today. So we need a kind of Ecclesiastes style, trying to have the best school, the best output, the best job for your kids is chasing the wind. So stop bringing your own narrative to your kids' lives. That's part of the deformation and the reformation of what it means to be a parent. And so I think churches are critical to that, because the part of the reason we have a problem with discipleship with the young generations is because we have a problem with the way the parents thought about what it means to be successful. Like, missions is much less viewed as an important career, not because young people don't want to do great things in the world, because their parents said, hey, like, if you, you should, why would you want
to be a doctor, right?
Why do you want to go to Africa, or why do you want to go on, you do these other kinds of crazy things? Like, you should get a good job, and then maybe someday if you want to, go on, so parents have really deformed some of their kids. And I just look at the mirror. I feel like I've got all the PowerPoint slides. I've got all the answers of how to raise a kid in faith. And I've made plenty of mistakes. So, that we're all sort of guilty as charged. Mm-hmm. But I think this idea of helping moms and dads say, we're going to help you provide, like, this is a good example of a pedagogical, how we teach people. You can preach your way, but what if we had a structured way of helping young people figure out their gifts and callings? And parents had a lot to gain from being a part of a Christian community where you are actually like discipled into who you are made to be in the world. That kind of personalization, and you're a participant in gospel mission. You look at the book of Acts, and it's like, we're out there in the world taking great journeys for God, trying to figure out where God is calling us next. The book of Acts is these human stories of people on mission with Jesus. I think this generation wants to be inspired by that kind of call to the world. And it may not look like missions of old, but it might look something like missions that we need more of that kind of vision for the great adventure that it is to follow Jesus.
You've long been an advocate of churches getting behind the people that they serve in terms of helping them figure out their ministry in the workplace, their vocation, their calling. I'm hearing that theme come up again. Anything else you wanna say about that? Because I think that's really good. When I was a pastor for 20 years, it's very easy, to sort of have a come and see approach. Come to me, I'll equip you. But you sit in a pew every week, and I do, and it's a very different place when you're sitting there. And I have a great pastor as well. Jeff's doing a fantastic job. But, I can't help but think if I was doing it over again, I might do it differently. Any more thoughts about how churches can equip lay people to realize their calling?
If you're a pastor who think you've really got it nailed when it comes to equipping people for ministry in the workplace, I would ask you to really think again. We find so few leaders who are really doing that well. And so I just want to be truthful and honest about that.
So the data is saying,
No, I mean, most Christian business leaders, they're just like, I go to church because it's what's expected of me, and they get out of it what they need. There's again, I'm not saying any of this cynically. It's just that I see a picture of the community of Jesus, these apostolic leaders who are entrepreneurs, these others who are in the world, people who are teaching in public schools and who are in the trades, and who have a vision for how God has wired them, and that they're being equipped and trained to go out and do work, to be pastors in their own community or spiritual influencers, to tell their stories better. And the weight of the data is that most churches just really have a hard time. So we hear from business leaders and entrepreneurs and those in sort of the faith and work space all the time who say, what could we do to help churches do better at this? And then we hear pastors who say, we're already doing it.
Just like,
yeah, no, we got this guy and he's on our board and he's a lawyer, and we got this guy on our board and he's a, developer. And it's like, doesn't it sound interesting that like the people that you put on your board and as elders, like you tend to think of them because of what they're accomplished out in the world, and you want them to help, balance your books or be an advisor because you got legal issues within the church. And so if we're being honest, sometimes we're pulling people into the Death Star because we think they can provide us with, they can provide us something. And again, I don't mean this cynically. If the weight of all of the voices that we are hearing at Barna, because we're a good like intermediary, we're trying to translate across these different portions of the church. If the weight of all of these entrepreneurs and Christian business leaders is saying, church, please do this better. And if the weight of all the pastors and leaders that we talk to are saying, we're already killing it, there's something lost in translation.
Yeah.
And so what about doing a survey where you simply say, hey, where are you guys working? What could we do to help equip you in your industries? I bet you if you try to draw a pie chart, if you work at a local church, if you try to draw a pie chart on the back of a napkin, what percentage of the people are working in different industries? What percentage of people are retired? What percentage of people are working from home? What percentage of people have a good sort of integration of faith and work? Is there a sacred secular divide that's happening within their mental space? Do they understand their spiritual gifts and how that gets applied out into the workplace? Are they vocationally oriented towards helping their kids understand what they should do in the world and the right size of these things? This is all part of this theme of vocational discipleship that we have talked about quite a bit. Thanks for asking. And so I think there's a real, just the best way I could ask a leader is like, hey, if you just talk to Christian business leaders in your community, the only thing I will say is I don't think the Christian business leaders understand what it's like to lead in a church where you're responsible for everything, but you control nothing. And I understand, having grown up in the church, my dad's a very, very effective pastor, and he, the church is not a business. The church does not operate on the principles of like growth principles that, business leaders like, well, if we just did this. So I do acknowledge that Christian business leaders can have a mindset that's like, well, if we just did this, it would all work out. But I'm just asking leaders to say, if it's possible that these Christian business leaders are telling us, and I've heard this now for several decades, that the church isn't working in the way they think it could. It's not they're just critiquing you. They're asking you to imagine a different and better way to be the church. And that's like just like moms need the church to be a place of community, Christian business leaders and those in the workplace need the church to be a place of community for them to work out how to live this. And if you changed your thinking and said, just what could, the classic Kennedy quote, like, ask not what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country. Ask not what your congregation can do to build your church, your board, your volunteer corps. Like, yes, there's all those things that are important roles to fill, but ask not what these people can do for you, but what they can do for the kingdom of Jesus out in the world. And, the very nature of a congregation is we congregate to be separate from the world. And that is a great, place of like, we need to be formed differently. But I think there's a real invitation that these leaders are offering us, these people who are working in the workplace, in the marketplace, to think differently about what a church does and how it forms them for life and mission in the world.
So I want to ask a few more questions, lightning round, if we can, as we wrap up. Any other data that's really got your eyes open and that you're focused on as we head into a whole new year?
I'm doing a lot of work on perceptions of Jesus and why we keep Jesus in sort of human-sized boxes. And, he often looks a lot like us. We make him in our own image. So I've been working quite a bit on that. Like, what is Jesus perceived to be, and how do we actually free him from
the Americanized, westernized Jesus?
Yeah, exactly. And it turns out Jesus is, he promises that whom the Son sets free is free indeed. So as we free Jesus, he frees us to be all we can be. And so we're finding quite a bit of things based on that. I think that's pretty fun. We're also trying, we were talking about this before we started recording, just it's less about a trend we're seeing, but more how we're thinking about the trends. We've been working on making our data more bite-sized, more video-based. We're calling it Barna Trends, and we'll have some things to talk about that in the coming months in terms of ways that Barna is sort of rethinking how we do content,
how you package and get your information out there. We're rethinking that as well. I mean, the blog isn't what it used to be. I still enjoy long-form content, long-form podcasting, but short bites of video. We're both making some big changes in that area.
And I think then, it's just seeing the power of gamified content, of a journey you're asking people to take, thinking about, what we can learn from the sort of the developer, like app developer, video game developer world.
People love progress, man.
Yeah. And so just recognizing there's a way of thinking about the journey we're inviting people to take. Is there more creative ways we could be thinking about that? I think that's the visual world that we're living in. We continue to do quite a bit of work on this sort of spiritual open audience, which we've talked about, and how to prepare people for really meaningful conversations in an era of spiritual openness. People want to be able to talk about their faith. And so we need to give them tools to listen without judgment, to ask the Holy Spirit to join us, to not force conclusions, but to also be really, convicted about the need to talk about Jesus. And people are hungry to do that.
It's kind of clear but open, right? That whole idea that I know what I believe, but I'm also not going to force it on you. I'm going to ask questions. I'm going to probe. I'm going to be open to your worldview. And I think, in this age too, when I think about what's effective, at least in my context, in terms of, post-Christian context, it's not setting up the straw man argument. It's creating the steel man. Like these people are not stupid.
Right.
They're very smart. They're very intelligent. Perhaps they haven't thought through things at a deep enough level that it's going to be a convicting worldview. But to take their views seriously, to really honor them and not insult them, and believe that they're somewhat intelligent.
Yeah, right. And I've come to, even though it's not my journey, interviewing a lot of people who have deconverted or deconstructing their faith. We're doing a lot of work on faith deconstruction, and it's like it's not.
What are you seeing there?
A huge percentage of people say, it's about a quarter of all Americans say they've deconstructed the faith of their childhood, and it's younger people are more likely to say that's true of them. I think it's sort of different than just regular doubt, like whether God is real. They're sort of saying, is there a business model underneath this? What was my Christian school background like? Why did we, learn certain things about the world that just don't seem to square with reality? I think memory is a really interesting thing, like the neuroscience of how memories change as we pull them up. So even in that, as we study people telling their story and their backstory, we have to acknowledge that people sometimes remember things accurately. Well, they always think they're remembering them accurately, but that's just, when you pull up a memory and sort of analyze it, it changes every time you remember it.
Yeah,
there's like quite a bit of neuroscience about that, how the science of memory. And so people will look back on their conversion experience and say, I was emotionally manipulated to become a Christian. The chord progression, the music was just right, the lights were out. And they actually look back on that and they're like, what, did Jesus really talk to me, or was I just, feeling it? And was it just a vibe? And so, we have to sort of convert people, heart, mind, body, and soul. This is some of the stuff that I'm sort of describing earlier, is like we have to give people an emotional connection to the Lord. We have to give them an intellectual and way of thinking about their work and their life and what it means to be a Christian. We have to give them a relational context. Like there's more to being converted than just sort of saying the sinner's prayer. And I think that's a huge opportunity for the church.
We've been talking a lot about overall ministry and approaches to ministry. Anything in church finances or even AI or anything that you've got your eyes on as the year opens?
In AI, I think it's a really fun and interesting. I've seen some of the content you're putting out that I think is really solid, which is see it as a tool. but also pay close attention. Most of the weight of our data is suggesting that people have quite a bit of skepticism about it. About 1 in 10 adults say they've used it often, but so it's still not a very common usage.
That's a pretty low adoption in the church world.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
but they hold mixed feelings about AI. 29% say they don't trust it. 35% say I'm curious about it. 21% say I'm fascinated by it. But I think it's going to be a huge new wave. You look at sort of just digitization, mobile technology, social media, smartphones. We're at a new kind of inflection point, I think, with content. One of my friends, Mark Miller, had this really interesting observation that he thought that God sometimes uses these kinds of trends to humble us and to say, you weren't all that. And he was like, I wonder if AI is sort of our way of God's way of sort of saying our idolatry of content and our ability to create is not just about being human. It's about, now the algorithms can do that. And so is there something about our idolatry of content, our idolatry of being able to be creators? Now, AI is not doing what humans can do in almost all the really generative, brand new, truly original pieces of art and thinking, but it is making it really simple to do what was incredibly complex before. And again, I think there's some really interesting both theological implications, practical implications of how we build our communities. Again, even some of these questions of building persuasive communities is going to be more difficult in an era of AI. People are going to have many more. If we the gospel according to YouTube, if we thought that was challenging, just wait till the gospel according to AI.
Yeah, it's interesting. I've been thinking about this a lot because I've been a user of ChatGPT for well over a year now, and I'm noticing I'm getting lazy. And I'm still, if it has my name on it, I've written it, even with podcast interview questions, ChatGPT is pretty decent, at making me think. But I'm like, it's almost like that debate. Remember in elementary school, are you allowed to use calculators or not?
Right.
And the teachers were like, no, not until this age, because they want you to figure out in your brain, this is how multiplication, this is how addition, subtraction, division works. Division was always a hard one for me, not a mathematician. But anyway, it was like, no, you need to learn these skills. Now, I've used a calculator every day of my life that I've had to do any math since I was, 14 or 15. But I wonder if it becomes like that. And then is it a necessary first principles skill for you to continue intellectually, to keep your agency, to keep your creativity, to keep some semblance of self in there, and even openness to the Holy Spirit? Or are you just to defer all that to a set of prompts or whatever is next in AI? I think it raises some really great questions because I think it could result in a lot of intellectual laziness on the part of those of us who create.
I'm on the board of a university, and I think a really helpful conversation we had recently was let's let the tools do the tools that help us avoid busy work, and then make sure that the places where we're really trying to advance student achievement and development and learning, we say these are off limits for ChatGPT and AI.
So do the hard creative work. Correct. And then let it sort out your calendar for you.
Correct. Now it's simpler said than done.
Yeah.
But I think that idea. So I think it's true that our society and Gen Z no one likes busy work for the sake of it. Although we could also say there are sort of virtues in doing certain things for the purpose of how it changes our relationship to the work. So sometimes busy work has, chopping wood or, you that's maybe not even defined as busy work, but like running the long form, calculations. Like I'm a firm believer that people use the tools that are available to them to make their lives as livable as possible, to be, we're a highly adaptable species. And so I think ChatGPT is here to stay, and it's going to be like tools that are going to make our lives infinitely easier. And we're going to find other ways of creating, roadblocks and barriers and other things that are easy. So I just think that as we even think about how to train people, imagine if at your church you had a short series of talks on the difference between real and fake, and authentic and inauthentic, and original and unoriginal, and truth versus error, or falsehood, and then recognizing that, young people actually, they're like, the human eye is pretty discerning, not just like AI generated images, but like how do we actually understand what is real, what's fake in our world? And that's an example of some, you may or may not preach that. It might not be a sermon, but it could be sort of a 101 class where you're saying, we're going to help this generation think about, where do we deploy these tools? How do we think about technology? How do we think about real versus fake? How do we actually understand when we say someone's really authentic? What does that mean? And why do we sometimes feel like someone's a little inauthentic? And
at our church, I'm doing a message in a week or two after this podcast releases on relationships and AI. What is the difference between a real human relationship and a virtual relationship, or a chatbot relationship, or a sex bot relationship, or all of that, where, and this isn't in the future, this is actually happening right now. You can have relationships with people who aren't real. What happens to your soul? What happens to you? How did God design human interaction? Those are all very real questions that people are now struggling with, or need to struggle with.
Yeah, and I think that gets to the heart of the Christian community, is helping to identify what does it mean to be human.
Exactly.
And in light of what Jesus has said with the revelation of God and through Scripture and the wisdom of the church through the centuries.
Well, anything else before we wrap up? This has been great.
It is so fun to do a podcast in person with you. I mean,
real David Kinnaman, the real Carey Nieuwhof, together in Dallas.
And now we should announce that this is just an AI-generated conversation where my voice and your voice have been put through the algorithms, and it just turns out that you think you've been listening to us.
Dude, it's so real now. It's crazy. Like, I've seen some of these. I was telling you about a friend who sent me an AI-generated thing of him speaking French. He doesn't speak French. And I'm like, it's so convincing. But this is the real Carey and the real David. Hey, people are going to want to connect with you, David. So where are you online these days? Tell us about the Barna Group and where they can find all of your latest good stuff.
Yeah, thanks. Well, we're shifting a lot of our emphasis in the coming months and years towards not just describing what's happening, but really providing solutions and examples of best practices, insights to action. So that's at Barna.com. We would love to invite people to be subscribers to our Barna Access, where you get all the best of Barna. There'll be some new tools in terms of the trends subscription, sort of little bite-sized pieces as well that people can be watching for. I'm available at Twitter and Instagram and, and the rest. And I'm really excited about what's next for our company and for how God is orienting us towards really trying to figure out the domains of digital discipleship. What does it mean to build persuasive communities under the light of the gospel?
As always, David, thank you. It's been great.
My pleasure. Thanks, Carey.